Right. So welcome everyone to today's Westchester CAPI cohort meeting. Great to see such a good turnout, and we have a pretty packed agenda, so hopefully we can jump right in. We're going to start with the presentations. First up, I'm going to ask Patty Zakatz, Assistant Village Manager from the Village of Ossining, to present, and then Elijah from Westchester County will be presenting, and then we'll move into talking about forecasting, and I'll end the meeting by talking about next steps and the public engagement process. So as usual, feel free to put questions in the chat or jump right in. We can keep this informal and hopefully have a good discussion. So with that, I will turn it over to Maddie, and I will allow you to share your screen, Maddie.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. So you've all set such a high bar for these presentations, so I hope that I don't let you down. I am going to start sharing now. So again, thank you to everybody who's on today and who set such a good example for the Village of Ossining. These are the inventory results for the Village of Ossining. I know you've already heard from the Town of Ossining a couple weeks ago. So a little update, if you're unfamiliar with us in the Village of Ossining, I encourage you to come visit. We are a population of just under 30,000 right in central Westchester on the Hudson River. We're about 3.2 square miles of land. We also have another equivalent area of village property that's underwater under the Hudson, obviously. We became a climate smart community in 2009, a clean energy community several years ago, and we've worked hard with Eleanor Peck, I saw on the call. She's been very, very helpful in helping get us points for past action. So that's been fantastic. And our current mayor, Rita Levin, who you see there with her e-bike over there on the right-hand side of the screen, has given the staff a challenge, and that's to become the cleanest or greenest community in the country. So certainly a very high bar, and I know a couple folks who are on this call are already in advance of us, but looking forward to encourage you to step up your game a little bit as well. So some couple grant awards of note as of late. In 2021, the Village of Ossining was named a recipient of the Downtown Revitalization Initiative, $10 million, along with our neighbors across the river in the Village of Haverstraw. We each got $10 million. And the New York Clean Transportation Prize for Electric Mobility, which is through NYSERDA. And that's going to be Project Mover, which again, you see the mayor with one of our e-bikes over on the right-hand side. That's a project that also involves the Town of Ossining, the Village of Tarrytown, the Village of Dobbs Ferry, and the Village of Croton, and primarily bringing pedal assist e-bikes to folks mainly in disadvantaged communities, but also making sure that folks who live in Ossining can reach services and places of business in other communities as well. And then finally, we received $4 million in federal funding for the Route 9 road diet, which some of you who are familiar with the river towns, you know that in Ossining, Route 9 is 4 lanes, 2 in each direction, whereas in places like Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow, it's a little bit easier for folks who are walking, biking to cross and get around safely because there's only 1 lane in each direction. So this is a project that the community's been asking for quite some time. We are finally able to get $4 million from the omnibus bill to be able to go ahead and move forward with that project. And we're hoping to break ground sometime in 2024. So all different ways that we are trying to address walkability, sustainability in the Ossining community, largely as a result of urban renewal policies that really damaged our community 50 years or more ago. So a background on the inventory, like all of you, we used the baseline year 2019 in terms of what vehicles we used. So an important note here, the Town of Ossining, and I see Mr. Margulies on the call as well, presented that they don't have a whole heck of a lot of buildings. They don't have as much infrastructure because largely many of the Town of Ossining services are provided by the Village of Ossining. So that's including, a couple administrative roles, but also the police department and the fire department. And then unlike the town, we actually have our own sanitation program. So we included our fleet vehicles, police cars, fire trucks, and also our sanitation vehicles, which, as you can imagine, use an awful lot of fuel. Also village-owned buildings. The town is a tenant in many of our buildings. So we have several village properties as well as 7 firehouses. 5 of which are owned by the village, but we pay utilities for all 7. Street lights, park and field lights, a sewer lift station, and then Indian Brook Water Treatment Plant. The village of Ossining is fortunate enough to have our own source of water, the Croton Reservoir, which you might know is adjacent to the GE property. So the town and the village share together in providing a water system, but all of those buildings and facilities are owned and operated by the village of Ossining. And then in terms of the scopes, you can see below, we included components of scope 1, which is our company vehicles, scope 2, which is purchased utilities, and scope 3, employee commute and leased facilities, which again is specific to those 2 firehouses that the village does not own. In terms of by sector, there wasn't anything here that was a huge surprise. Buildings and facilities was obviously well out in front, seconded by our vehicle fleet, then employee commute, waste or water and wastewater treatment facilities, and finally streetlights and traffic signals. However, sort of poking through the numbers in ClearPath, if you were to move the Indian Brook Water Treatment Plant out of the buildings and facilities category and into water and wastewater treatment facilities, where I believe it technically belongs, you would see this this ranking sort of turned on its head a little bit, with water and wastewater going much higher to the top. So in terms of by sector, like many of you, many of our municipal buildings are an older building stock. So for example, right now I'm sitting in Village Hall, which is right on our main drag here on Croton Avenue. This building was built in about 1900, and there have been sort of piecemeal maintenance opportunities, you know, throughout the last century and bit, but substantially it's the same building with a lot of the same issues. And Steamer Firehouse was actually the first firehouse in the village of Ossining, built for a time when people were using horses and buckets to put out fires, and not a whole lot has changed to that facility since that time as well. So certainly there's been limited renovations in other facilities in terms of making sure that the windows are shored up and making sure that we have, you know, the insulation that would be appropriate for today's climate for heating and cooling. So those are places we know we need some work. In terms of our vehicle fleet, we went through those records very carefully. We used just over 110,000 gallons of vehicle fuel in the 2019 year, about 50-50, a little bit more of the unleaded as opposed to the diesel. We didn't address the solid waste for employee commute. We didn't have an outstanding turnout of folks doing the survey, but we were able to extrapolate about 67% of our employees commute by small SUV or truck, going just shy of 1 million miles back and forth to work every year. The streetlights was a relatively small portion of our electricity bill. We did convert to the LED streetlights back in 2015, at the same time as the town of Ossining did, I believe. And then finally, for wastewater and water treatment facilities, was just under half of all of electricity used by village facilities, which is in support of water filtration, distribution, and storage. And again, that's for the village and town of Ossining. The village population is about 27,000 and change, whereas the town population is just over 5,000. And so these are all the different facilities that are included in that segment of our inventory. As far as challenges, bookkeeping, we do have a what we call the gas boy. It's basically a centralized gas pump that's used by the village of Ossining, the town of Ossining, Ossining schools, and Ossining Volunteer Ambulance Corps, as well as our fire and police department. So to go through this, we had to go through 1,000 pages of the data for 2019, and the way that it is sort of separated out, it was not the most convenient. You had to know by operator name, and then some of our operators wore more than one hat, so you had to sort of tease out, was John Smith working for the village highway department when he was getting gas, or for the fire department? So that was a bit of a challenge. For Con Edison and NYPA, just to make sure that we got this done in a timely fashion, we used their records, which in an ideal world, we would have been able to get our own figures by pulling old vouchers. And then finally, with propane and heating oil, we still use a paper-based voucher system. And so when you go to enter in the title, not all users are using the same format to enter the title of the vouchers. So what would have been helpful would have been, okay, on March 1st, 200 gallons at $3.56 per gallon. That was unfortunately not the case. So it involved a lot of pulling of those papers and going through records to find those numbers. I also mentioned the leased buildings. The two that are not owned by the village, we have very little control over the work that's done in those buildings to make them more energy smart. So that's something that's a little bit out of our control in terms of controlling the utilities there. And also bandwidth. When this project came online, and the village agreed to participate in CAPI, it was 2019. As I mentioned in the first slide, we have an awful lot of other projects going on right now. So finding staff time to dedicate to this was also a bit of a struggle. And then finally, getting off-road vehicle data was a little bit difficult. But the good news is in October of last year, our Parks Department converted to largely electric-powered landscaping equipment. So you can see some photos down here. So we've actually made our own green zones. About half of our village parks are now green zones where only these electric-based landscaping equipment pieces can be used. So hopefully going forward, even though we've been having trouble getting the data for the off-road, we will actually be using less gas-powered equipment for our off-road vehicles, and there will be less to track once we start doing so. In terms of takeaway and learnings, I wish we had set up a committee. This ended up being something that was coming mostly out of the manager's office, and that took quite a bit of time. I think it would have helped to have had more hands in the pot, and also to give a more well-rounded perspective on things that we should be exploring and get different ideas from folks working among different village departments. I also think it would be helpful if we had started benchmarking before this project, because it's hard to see how we have improved or done worse without having that legacy data. And so going forward, we're hoping that we can encourage more alternative transportation among village staff, not just in terms of commuting back and forth to work, but also many of our employees are out in the field. How can we find ways that they can use things other than pickup trucks, gas-powered equipment when they're out in the field, and perhaps use something like the e-bikes that are part of Project Mover. So perhaps for our police department or our code enforcement officers. And then also finding a way to better centralize the detailed records for our utility bills. I know that some folks who had done the presentation spoke about some of the software that they used and very much liked. So we have a demo pending with one of those companies. So in conclusion, I want to thank the CAPI team, certainly Mary and Kale, but also we had two fantastic interns who helped us with the employee commute, and then some entries into ClearPath, Francis and Becca. I also want to thank the Village of Ossining Board of Trustees, Green Ossining, and the Village's Environmental Advisory Council. You folks all know Susie Ross, who's the founder of Green Ossining. I know she's been working on this project from the other side, but she's an invaluable asset to our community and all of the green initiatives that we have here, as well as Kate Schlott, who's the chair of our EAC. I know she's been involved in this project as well. It would be impossible without those two ladies in particular, but also without the support of our board to have been able to do this project, but also to do anything that's in support of our pollinator gardens and all of our other exciting initiatives that we have to try and make a cleaner and greener community for all 27,000+ of Ossining's residents. So thank you very much. Happy to take any questions. And if something comes to you, or if you want to come visit, feel free to contact me directly. My email address is maddie@villageofossining.org. And you can also find us on Instagram @Village of Ossining. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Maddie. That was really impressive. 1,000 pages of manual data. I can't even imagine. So impressive and well done. I don't know if anyone has any questions. If not, we will move on to Elijah, and you can ask questions at the end as well. So feel free to ask them, but I will quickly introduce Elijah Reichland Melnick, Assistant Director of Sustainability, Westchester County. And Elijah, I will let you share your presentation.
Great, thanks. Let me figure out how to do that. Share screen.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
You got it.
Great. And can you all see this now?
Yes.
Okay, so great to be with you all. This has been a lot of work to get to this point, and we'll do some thank yous in a few minutes. But obviously, we've got Pete McCart, my boss, and the Director of Energy Conservation and Sustainability here on the call as well. So Pete has been instrumental in letting me be in a position to be able to do this. So let's go ahead to the inventory results. And this was a long process because Westchester is very large. And then we have a very big county government. Just to add a little background, as I'm sure most of you know, our population in the county is a bit over 1 million people as of the 2020 census. And as you see, it's a very politically split county in terms of the number of local governments that make it up. 6 cities, 19 towns, 23 villages, 48 school districts. We have a lot of local governments, but it's a diverse population. About 50% of the county is white, 27% Hispanic or Latino, 17% Black, and about 8% Asian. In terms of our physical space, we've got, as you know, a lot of exposure to rising sea levels, about 10 miles of shoreline on Long Island Sound, not counting all of the little bays and inlets and such, and about 34 miles along the Hudson River. And many of these areas will be vulnerable as sea level starts to rise in the years to come. There's a lot of communities that have been designated as environmental justice communities based on historic legacies of racism and other projects being put there that shouldn't have been, and particularly that includes parts of Yonkers and Mount Vernon, New Rochelle, Portchester, White Plains, Elmsford, Ossining, and Peekskill. And Mary, one of the things that Mary pointed out, and I think it's absolutely right, is that because we're close to New York City, and New York City is itself vulnerable to rising sea level and other climate-related challenges in the decades to come, we might see an influx of new people moving up from New York above and beyond what has already happened, just to take advantage of the fact that relative to the city, we're better positioned to withstand the challenges of climate change. So this is an inventory, obviously, for Westchester County's government, and just a little background on the county government. Extremely large. The annual budget's over $2.3 billion as of this year. And we have more than 4,600 county employees as of 2019, which was the baseline year that we've used for the inventory. The county operates dozens of buildings and facilities all throughout Westchester, a huge park system. There's more than 50 facilities, more than 18,000 acres. And of course, that increases our exposure to climate change impacts as well. Things like invasive species that are moving into our area because the county has a lot of responsibility directly for that. We also manage 7 wastewater treatment facilities, which we'll talk more about in a minute or two. So the background of the inventory, just like everybody else, we chose 2019. And the things we included are sort of the standard ones that everybody else has put in as well. Buildings, facilities, streetlights, traffic signals, vehicle fleet, the transit fleet, which is a little different because unlike a lot of the municipalities, Westchester runs a bus system, which had to be accounted for as well. The employee commute, a closed landfill on Croton Point, the wastewater treatment facilities, and some refrigerant emissions as well. What we didn't include is, again, facilities that are in the county, but that we don't as a county government own or operate. And that includes things like Westchester Community College that is run by the SUNY system. It's not part of county government, and it does include the Wheelabrator Westchester facility in Peekskill that has come up for a lot of discussion, but we did look at that and concluded pretty clearly that because the county doesn't own the facility and doesn't operate it, that it wasn't appropriate to include it in this inventory for county government emissions, although of course we would want to include it if there was a community-wide greenhouse gas inventory conducted. So here's the bottom line. What we came up with is that Westchester's total county government emissions were 139,370 metric tons, which is a lot, but we are a big county, as we said. It breaks down similar to almost everywhere else. Buildings and facilities is the largest share, followed by, in our case, the transit fleet, all the Beeline buses and the paratransit system, and we'll talk about why in a minute. The solid waste, which again accounts for emissions generated by the Croton Point landfill, we'll also get to. That's a significant and a surprisingly large share of the emissions, even though the landfill has been closed for almost 40 years now. The employee commute, a little under 10% of emissions, about 7% coming from water and wastewater treatment facilities, mostly the wastewater. The county's vehicle fleet generates over 7,000 tons, but that's still only about 7% of emissions, or 5% of emissions, excuse me. And then the traffic lights, the signals, and the refrigerants were under 1%, a very small contributor. So the buildings and facilities, which again is itself 36% of the total, the overwhelming majority of that comes from natural gas use. And that really does speak to the challenges of running, as Maddie just said, many of the county's buildings are older as well, just like the village. And there hasn't been as much new construction of government buildings in the last 40 years. So you've got less energy efficient structures all over Westchester. And that has contributed right there just through natural gas, mostly to heat in the buildings, to over 30,000 metric tons of emissions in 2019. Fuel oil as well adds another 11,000. The electric use for the building is large, but itself is only about 14% of this total. And an important note is it says, because we account for water or wastewater emissions separately, those electric bills associated with those facilities are not included in the electric use for the county buildings facilities chart here. So the transit fleet is a significant share of the emissions, 22% overall, and this comes from the Beeline bus system and the paratransit bus system that the county operates. As you can see, it is an enormous system. In 2019, nearly 10 million miles traveled by the Beeline buses, with paratransit adding another 4.3 million miles. And so overall, that accounted to about 3 million gallons of diesel and gasoline and over 14 million miles traveled. I know Peter's made a point of saying, and it's absolutely true, since 2019, the county has been making major strides in electrifying the bus system and getting new hybrid buses in. So we're certainly hoping that the next time we do an inventory, this number of emissions is going to be significantly down, and the number of gallons of fuel used would also drop significantly the next time we conduct an inventory. So solid waste is really interesting. I mean, as this shows, the last time the counties actually added waste to the Croton Point landfill was 1986, which was 37 years ago. But nevertheless, according to the EPA, the emissions coming out of this landfill, primarily from methane venting from a lot of the decaying materials there, still is 29,554 metric tons of emissions, which by itself is more than the employee commute, the water and the wastewater, the vehicle fleet, and the street lights all combined. This really shows the challenge of reducing emissions when some aspects of it are basically stuck. You know, that the landfill's there, we have to deal with it, but we can't really do much more than wait for the materials to break down. The good news, according to the EPA, if you look at this chart up in the right, is that the trend is clearly in the right direction. Even since 2010, emissions generated by the Croton Point landfill have dropped from over 40,000 metric tons per year to into the 20s. And the trend is in the right direction. So we hope as the years to come, it'll reduce further, but it does just show we're in some ways hampered by what decisions people made decades ago when it comes to reducing emissions in the present. The employee commute, so we had, it's 9% total, just under 700 employees who worked for Westchester as of 2019 took the survey. And the results were both unexpected and parts we would expect. Obviously, the vast majority of people who surveyed do drive alone to work. 90% said they typically drive themselves to work alone, but the bus was a fairly common alternate for people who didn't drive alone. And what was interesting, and I think really encouraging, is almost half of employees said they would consider an alternate means of commuting, whether it's a bus, a train, walking, carpooling, biking. We were able to collect data on the average commute distance for the employees, which was an average of about a little over 20 miles, and the median of a little smaller, of 15 miles, because the average was inflated by some people with very long commutes. So based on the survey data, we were able to extrapolate out to the total number of employees working for Westchester at the beginning of 2019 and estimate that in 2019, those employees drove over 36 million miles to and from work. When you would add in employees who commuted by bus from outside the county, that adds another 1.1 million miles of travel for employees. And so the total for those two categories adds up to a little over 12,000 metric tons of emissions. We were also able to track where the employees are coming from, which you can see in the pie chart there. 2/3 coming from Westchester, not unexpectedly. But the rest, fair amount of folks commuting up from the city, doing a reverse commute. And then, as you see, about 7% each from Putnam and Dutchess, 3% each from Fairfield, Connecticut, from Rockland and from Orange County, and then a scattering from other parts of the region. So with wastewater and water treatment facilities, county operates 7 facilities. You can see the 7 communities there, and they are producing emissions primarily through their heavy power use, because you have to run these facilities pretty much 24/7 unless you want some major sewer backups and wastewater spills. But they also are contributing, unfortunately, through the emission of nitrogen and methane as the waste breaks down, and the combusting at some of them of digester gas from these facilities. You can just see we broke it out a little bit. The electric use itself is 3,000 metric tons. Yonkers is by far the largest facility. It serves the largest population and generates the most emissions, followed by Mamaroneck and New Rochelle, and the others are significantly smaller facilities with much less carbon footprint. The vehicle fleet, as we mentioned, about 6% of the total. The county operated about 1,300 on-road vehicles as of 2019. And even then, and we know this has improved in the years since, already 19% of those were hybrids, and 19% were hybrids, 19 were diesel, and 62% were gas powered. We know the hybrid number has continued to grow since 2019. They also operate, and we also own more than 3,000 off-road vehicles and other powered pieces of equipment like lawnmowers, snow blowers, hedge trimmers, weed whackers, things like that, light trailers for highway night work. That was, and we'll talk in the challenges, it was hard to get specific data on how much fuel the various sectors of our vehicle fleet are using. We did have access to the overall amount used, but we don't know how much was coming from the on-road vehicles and how much was coming from those off-road sources. So challenges, as I mentioned, tough to find the fuel use data for off-road equipment. We weren't able to get the vehicle miles traveled for the county vehicle fleet, either at large or per each vehicle, which would have been great to get a more accurate understanding of emissions. And also, is just in general, as I'm sure many of the communities figured out, it's sometimes challenging. You take the information that you get from the departments and have to figure out how to put that in the format for ClearPath. So that continued to be a challenge, but I think with help from Mary and Carolyn and Kale and everybody else, we were able to make it work well. So finally, the key findings, as we mentioned, buildings and facilities by far the biggest share of county emissions. But we know that investing in energy efficiencies, electrification is going to significantly reduce emissions from that sector. The transit fleet is a big contributor as well, but as we replace diesel buses with electric buses, it's already going down, we know, and in the years to come, hopefully will significantly go down. And it was encouraging. The employee commutes aren't a significant share overall, but to the extent that we can get people out of their cars, or into another carpool or into a bus or a train, or building better bike infrastructure, we'll be able to reduce the emissions from employee commuting as well. As we mentioned, would have been great to be able to get emissions broken out on-road, off-road. Couldn't quite do that this time, but we hope to in the future. And then the last thing is, just as I think in most places, the street lights and traffic lights just aren't a significant contributor to emissions. Partly that's because many have been electrified, and also the county doesn't own a lot of them. Many are owned by local cities, towns, villages, and municipalities. We also looked briefly at the use of refrigerant in the chillers at Rye Playland, and it adds a couple hundred tons, but in the scheme of the county, it is still a fairly small contributor to our emissions. So we thank the county executive for supporting this effort, and certainly thank Mary and the whole team at HVRC, Carolyn and the team at ICLEI, and as you can see, many of the county employees who helped get data together for our project. So thanks to everybody who contributed, and that is our inventory. Mary, you're muted.
Thanks, Elijah. That was really interesting, and also a beast. So I appreciate all the effort that went into that. I know, like Maddie, there was, not an easy trail of records to follow, and that you had to go to many sources to put this all together. So hopefully it was a worthwhile effort, and hopefully it will be easier moving forward.
And one other thing, Peter reminded
Yeah.
me to mention, the county has achieved bronze certification status as a climate smart community, which is, you know, a sign of the county's, how the county's moving forward.
Aleta, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more, because I think it might be interesting to the other communities, about your employee commute survey, what questions you asked. I know you were able to glean some additional data. I know you referenced it a little bit, but I think, you know, it's a big effort to do the survey and to get people to fill it out, and sometimes there's pushback. So I just wondered what other questions you chose to include and what you learned from those.
So we kind of juiced it a little bit by offering an incentive that anybody that took the survey would be entered into the chance to win a $25 gift card. So I do think that helped with responses. And we actually got over 1,000 responses, but some of them, because we were only interested in hearing from people that had been, for purposes of this project, had been working for the county in 2019, we had to sort of, you know, we weren't able to use about 400 of the responses that we got because of that. But yeah, so we asked questions, added some questions very specifically on what sorts of things what would it take them to get them out of the car into a carpool, riding a bike, taking a train, riding a bus, any of those things. And also to get more specific information, we asked people to tell us the make, model, and year of the car they were driving in 2019. So that allowed us to actually kind of do a more granular look at what was the average mileage that people were driving, or what was the average mileage people were getting, rather, on their vehicles, which was different than the national average, which was in the ClearPath tool, and I think was better, both for light trucks, you know, SUVs, and for passenger cars. And my guess on that is that Westchester employees were driving, probably on average, slightly newer and more fuel efficient vehicles in 2019 than the national average. And that makes sense because we're a relatively affluent community in the national scheme of things, and county employees are probably paid above the national average in income and could afford somewhat more recent vehicles. And so that helped in some ways lower the amount of emissions that the county was generating, because employees were driving more fuel efficient cars. We asked specifically what zip code people lived in and where they worked, and so we were able to get a pretty accurate estimate of how many miles they were commuting. And so those were some of the things we sort of added onto the base survey template, which was provided.
Really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
So I see, I mean, there's a bunch of questions about Wheelabrator. I don't know if Peter, because you've been here longer, if you want to chime in on those in the chat.
Yeah, I would say, you know, this is something we debated, you know, for a couple years now, and we finally got a ruling, you know, basically from ICLEI and the DEC, and you know, it was a real struggle, and you know, we really wanted to make a market, you know, comment about the fact that you know, we're not walking away from it or anything like that. It's just for the standards that we were set to follow, we were not to include it. So, but that doesn't mean we're not taking a look at it and doing anything and everything we can to make sure things don't go there. We need to recycle more, and we have some very innovative projects and programs and initiatives on that. I see that Courtney also asked about Rye Playland. Why did we include Rye Playland? As of 2019, we did own and operate Playland then, but we don't now. So it's run by Standard Amusements. That's the difference there on that. But you know, with Mary and everybody, we debated and talked about it. I kept on kind of pushing that it should be in there, but it just didn't fall under it. So I believe Mary can even speak to it a little more than myself.
And in terms of the question, I see from Heather about Croton methane emissions. That's a really good question. I don't know technically what's involved in capturing methane emissions. If there is a way to do that from a technical perspective, then I would hope the county would look into that. I just don't know enough about the science of whether that's possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. They are doing anything and everything they can to capture that. It's state of the art capture. It was very, very surprising to me and Elijah, and I brought it up to several people that we were all just flabbergasted by it. But we got the numbers from the EPA. You know, this is actual, you know, certified numbers from the EPA. So that's what we took and that's what we used. And I agree. I brought it up to Dave Kavinga. I was like, wow, check this out. This is very alarming. So that's it.
I think Ellen has a hand up as well. Ellen, did you want to say something?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you so much, Elijah. This was such an excellent presentation. I'm sure quite a, a set of tasks to, pull together all of that information. Actually, I did have that question about the landfill and the greenhouse gas emissions from there. And certainly we understand that it's not just methane. There are many other greenhouse gases, and for the purposes of this inventory, though, I know it's a little bit more limited, but that is a piece of information that is crucial. Unfortunately, even with the landfill cap, it's kind of the gift that keeps on giving. And also in terms of the Wheelabrator, I know that I see that that Courtney pointed out that the Title V air permit is permitted to the county IDA. And my concern is just that here we have all these excellent presentations, by the county and by all of the various municipalities that have been working so hard over this project. But we have a really significant quantity of greenhouse gases that are just unaccounted for from this facility alone, and just seeing what the annual emissions data that comes out, and that's just a snapshot, and that is just capturing carbon dioxide, and that alone on an annual basis can vary up and down depending on the garbage that is being burned. But I think it was in 2020, counts for several hundred millions of pounds of carbon dioxide for that year alone that was emitted. So we're missing something here. And, if we're trying to capture and get a real good understanding of what our greenhouse gas inventory is, whether it's the landfill and the Wheelabrator, that somewhere, these components are really critical, and for us to really have a handle on what not just the county but the municipalities need to be doing. It's just solid waste is a huge issue, and I just want to understand better how this is all accounted for ultimately, so that we have the best, not only the best data, but the best assessment that we can provide.
Yeah. So Ellen, we hear you. And, like I just mentioned, we debated this over and over and over. And it's something, I took a little bit of a different stance. I will just say one thing, look at Wheelabrator compared to the landfill. Look at that. And we can't be landfilling here in Westchester, and we're not going to push it out on our neighbors. But so anyway.
I just
the other
want to correct something there. Just thank you, Pete. Just so that it's clear, the Wheelabrator doesn't replace landfilling, because the toxic ash, and there are thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of tons really of toxic ash from the Wheelabrator that is then shipped to landfills. And actually it was being dumped locally, I believe, in a location near Peekskill or in Peekskill for a time, but it exclude landfilling. That's still part of the, essentially it's a processing that happens before the landfilling. Unfortunately, it's not just incinerating, we're still landfilling because we have so much toxic ash. I'd have to look up the exact proportion of how many tons of waste in for every number of tons in produces a certain amount of toxic ash coming out. So it's not just the air pollution and the greenhouse gases, it's also still more landfilling that happens. So thank you.
So,
Yeah.
and I want to, Ellen, the one other thing I just want to sort of add on that is you're absolutely right. I mean, there's huge amounts of emissions which aren't captured in this, and that's somewhat the nature of, I guess, this sort of government inventory of government emissions and municipal emissions that we're doing. I mean, for instance, the buildings, facilities, that was the big, just electric use and natural gas use for county-owned buildings was the biggest contributor to the county government's emissions. But obviously the 90+%, 95, 99% of buildings in Westchester County are not owned by the government, they're privately owned. And so just that alone, there's enormous quantities of emissions that can't even possibly be captured by this process, which would have to be an entirely different study of what's the county at large through the community producing.
Good point.
I mean, and the vehicles too, obviously the Westchester County employees are driving 36 million miles a year is our estimate, but most people who work in Westchester don't work for county government. And so there's, unimaginable amounts, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of millions of miles being driven by Westchester residents each year, which again, it's just an entirely different scale and an entirely different project that would need to be undertaken.
And we've got two major highways that run through it. So we got people that are outside of Westchester County that are contributing to our terrible air quality here in Westchester. But I'm sure Mary wants to move along.
We should actually move along. Thanks, Pete. We do have a pretty packed agenda, but definitely to be continued. So a lot of, it's really interesting debate. And I think there is certainly some room in terms of the definitions under the protocol around being owned and operated that raises some real questions. But I suppose that's where the community greenhouse gas inventory comes into play. So again, to be continued, but thank you again, Elijah, and thanks, Maddie. Those were great presentations, and there's a reason why you guys went last, because you had to, I think, maybe arguably the biggest task. So again, well done. And that concludes actually all of the inventories and all the inventory presentations. So congratulations to everyone in the cohort. I'm thrilled that you all are done. And I know many of you have also completed the reports, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. For those of you that haven't finished, I have some FAQ question and answers that I'll go through. But before we get to that, I'm going to turn it over to Caroline to talk about emissions forecasting. Thanks, Caroline.
Great. Thanks, Mary. While I share my screen, I'm also just going to add a couple points to the discussion we were just having. So I think it's important to really note that this cohort is just focused on local government operations. So kind of echoing what Elijah was saying, with accounting for these emissions, we're really focused on what you all can do a lot more easily through your own operations. You have the most control over those choices, whereas the community-wide emissions are a little bit harder, and it comes down to politics and policies that will allow you to make those changes in the community. So for the purpose of this, we're just focused on those owned and operated emissions. Whereas scope 3, it gets a little bit harder because it's harder to control your contractors. And we can go on and on about this, and you should all come to office hours so we can talk about it more. But I highly recommend you all think about doing community-wide inventories so that you can fully capture things like wheelabrator that are also impacting your communities, because that's really where those emissions are going to be captured, and give you a better understanding of how you can tackle those emissions that you do have a little bit less control of, unfortunately. So also on that note, I think that's a good segue into this next piece, because I'm going to be presenting now on forecasting emissions and using forecasting to help you identify ways to reduce your emissions. So Mary sent a demo video on how to do this, and it may have been a little bit confusing because it was geared towards community-wide inventories. So different sectors, a little bit of different circumstances. So I'll be showing the local government operations side of forecasting today, including both your business as usual forecast. So what your emissions will look like from your local government operations by 2030 if you essentially do nothing. And then I'll also show you how to model some reduction strategies in ClearPath so that you can actually model some of the actions you might include in your climate action plan. So this will set you up really well for writing your climate action plan, as well as engaging with stakeholders and showing them where some of the strategies you want to include can actually be making impacts. So with that, I'm going to dive into showing you around ClearPath and how to do all this work. One thing I also want to mention, this is a little bit more complicated in some ways than the inventory process, and there are a lot of decisions you'll have to make based on your own community and your own circumstances. So I highly encourage you coming to office hours in order to have those discussions with me and Mary, and we can help you kind of sort through what inputs you should be putting into ClearPath based on your own individual circumstances.
Caroline, can
Okay.
I jump in with a quick comment?
Yes, please.
I just wanted to say that after this call, I'll be sending out a wizard guidance document that Caroline and I put together that gives you a step-by-step guide to filling out the steps to your business as usual forecast. So don't feel you need to write everything down that Caroline says, and hopefully the guidance document will help a lot in terms of getting this step done. Thanks.
Perfect. Yes, thanks, Mary. So some of the data that will be going into this process will be included in that step-by-step guide from us, and you'll be able to use that data, so it'll be a little bit more straightforward. But yeah, with that, I will start. So you're in ClearPath. This is your home screen. Just like with the inventory process, you're going to go to the government track. And this is important. You may not have been using this navigation piece of ClearPath before. So typically you've been using this inventories module is what we call them. But for the business as usual forecast, we're going to go into the forecast module. And it's going to look a lot like your inventory screen, your different forecasts, if you have any in your account, which I'm assuming most of you don't, they will appear here once you do. And you can always navigate back to them through this screen, which I'll get to in a moment. But for today, we're starting a forecast, and to do this in the wizard tool, which is our newer, a little bit easier to use platform, you're going to use the start wizard button. And just like in inventory, you start with kind of a parameters section. We're going to want to name it, and I would highly recommend naming it kind of like in the inventory. I like to do the community name and then specify that it's your local government operations. The end year of the forecast is what I usually put here. And then I'm just saying that this is my business as usual forecast so that I'm not confusing it with any forecasts that include reduction measures. And then the next piece, you're going to want to select the inventory that you are doing the forecast for. So this is a demo account, so they're kind of weird names in it, but I just want to make sure I'm using this full inventory because that's my fully robust and completed inventory. And then for the end year, you'll select, for this cohort, we're just going to do 2030. But if you ever want to do forecasting in the future, you can always select a different year, whether it's 2040, 2050. You have that option, which is great. And one thing I also need to mention here, when you start this process, really make sure that your inventory is fully complete. It's been reviewed, so that QA/QC review process that you went through with mostly myself, some others at ICLEI helped. But just make sure you've done all of the updates to your inventory in ClearPath, because unfortunately, this tool won't, once you create the forecast, like I just showed you, it won't automatically update based on the inventory changes you make. So make sure your inventory is all set and ready to go. which I believe you all are ready, but it does happen that you come across a mistake when you're doing this or something. So just a heads up, and I can walk you through that later if you come across that issue. But yeah, so I'll keep going. So this is how you create the forecast. You're just going to hit save. And then ClearPath kind of automatically jumps you to step 2, which is really nice. And so this step is really important. This is where you're going to create growth rates, which are the rates that impact your emissions in your forecast. So it'll probably make a little bit more sense as we go along, but one thing to think about is, and I have a lot in here for Dutchess County, but I'll show you your own as well. But think about the things that are going to impact emissions in the future. So things like population growth in the county could impact your wastewater treatment processes. If there are more people in the county and or your town or village, and they're consuming more water, you're going to have more wastewater processes that are taking place. So population projections would be impacting those emissions in the future. And again, I'll keep talking about these as we go on, but just to give you a little background on what we're doing in this step. So I'm going to demonstrate just a couple of growth rates. You can certainly add others that you think of and have the data for, but just to get you started. So to add a new one, you click this add new growth rate. You shouldn't have any here unless somebody else in your account has created one in the past, but assume that nothing's here. And you'll click add new growth rate, and then this box will appear. And let's see, I'm going to start with the population. So I'll probably just call it Westchester County population growth. You can name it whatever you think is easiest for you to identify. But you definitely want to make it clear to anyone else looking into their path what this may be. Notes, you could say where you obtain the data. I'd highly recommend that. So this was actually from Elijah at Westchester County. So you could add a note like that. Or you could also add any information on data gaps or assumptions that were made in obtaining this data, just like in your inventory. And so the next step for growth rates, there are a few different methods of like applying the growth rates in ClearPath. So you'll select this drop-down menu. And luckily, population is probably the most straightforward. So you'll go and select total population. And your initial value is the population of Westchester County in 2019, which I actually have pulled up. So this is the number you'll be putting into ClearPath, but like Mary said, we will be sharing this, so you don't need to write it down. So that's the 2019 value. And then you're going to add the end year, which is the end year of your forecast, so 2030, and the population that has been projected for that year. Now, just for future reference, or if you have more local data for your own communities, you can always add more end years. So if you had, say, a 2025 projection, you could add that here. Or if you were going all the way out to 2050, you might want to add 2030, 2040, those kind of in-between years of population projections. But 2030 is fairly close, so we can just do that end year value. And you'll end it with hitting save. And then it should appear down at the bottom. Oops, I realized I forgot to delete the one that I was practicing with, but yeah, so it appears right here. And let's see. Yeah, so that's the population growth. You can actually do the exact same for an employee count projection if that data is available to you. And I might have to work with you all a little bit more in office hours to figure that out. One way that I've done it before, it's probably pretty uncommon to actually have an employee count projection for your town or community, but you could always just take the past year's employee counts. So the number of employees working at your local government for each year from, say, 2010 to 2020. And then you could use that data to make your own projection. Just it would be based on a lot of assumptions, but it could still be useful in terms of, showing what may or may not happen to some of your emissions. So in order to do that, it is the exact same. I'm just going to say local government, operations, employee count. And again, you can add notes, maybe explaining how you got those numbers, and you'll just do the exact same thing. And I just have an example data set that I'll pull. So this employee count is actually attached to the example data that I'm using, so it is a good one to include here. And again, that's just going to be your 2030 end year value. Save. And then the last one I'm going to show you. So Westchester County actually has a little bit of a unique situation in terms of your electricity grid decarbonization projection. So in Westchester County, you're all getting your electricity from NYPA, which is a New York State organization. And also, if anyone has a better idea of things with NYPA, please correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not local to your area. So it's good for me to have these discussions with you all if you think anything is incorrect. But for NYPA, they are already at over 80% renewable energy because of all their hydro projects, right? So your emissions from the grid intensity from electricity in your area is already above the CLCPA goal of 70% renewable by 2030. So I think in your case, it makes the most sense to include a no growth rate for your electricity grid projections. In other circumstances, in other communities, they might be on an electricity, just to give a little more background on this, in other circumstances, a community might be on a grid or using a utility that only has 30% renewables as of their inventory year, but by 2030, they're expected to reach 70%. So that's what you normally would be applying in this situation, but we're going to use no growth for that instead, because like I said, NYPA has already sort of surpassed the statewide CLCPA goal of 70% renewable by 2030. So for no growth, and you can use this for a few other things that I will show throughout the next few steps. But for a no growth rate, I just like to title it no growth. And instead of, I mean, you could do this probably through any of them, but the one that makes the most sense to me is actually this other feature. And this is where, like I was just saying with grid decarbonization, if you were in a community that was at 30% renewables in 2019, you could put 0.7 here. It's a little backwards, I know it gets confusing, but 0.7 here is saying that your grid in 2019 is only 30% renewable and 70% non-renewable, right? And then if you were going to be fully decarbonized by 2030, your electricity grid is going to be fully decarbonized, you would put in an end value of 1. So, or am I getting, yeah. And put 2030. But like I said, we're doing no growth for your situation. So we're going to put an initial value of 1 and an end value of 1, because that's just saying no change by 2030. And just like with population growth, you can always add interim targets, but for no growth, that doesn't really make sense. So you'll just hit save. And those are the 3 growth rates that I'll show you today. You could also add things like, you'll see there's commercial square footage. If you know your government is going to build a new building by 2030, you could account for it in a growth rate through here. For community-wide inventories, you could account for commercial job projections, that sort of thing. So a lot of different growth rates can go in here. And that other feature is really where you could add more customized ones, which I can always talk you through. So that's it for growth rates. Just for time's sake, I'm going to keep moving on, but hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. Again, just come to office hours. because I'm sure there will be more questions on this, and especially ones more specific to each of your communities. But once you have created all the growth rates you think you need, you can always go back and add more if you want to later on. But for the purpose of this, we're going to say we're done. You can hit next and move on to the next section. Sorry. So this is where we're actually going to be applying the growth rates to your emissions. So this part is a little bit trickier for me to show because a lot of it is going to be based again on your own community's specific circumstances, or your own specific plans for things that might be happening by 2030. So I'll keep talking about that as we go, but this is where you're actually saying that, for example, employee count is going to impact your electricity emissions. You're expecting to see electricity emissions grow with the number of employees you have. So that's just an example of kind of what this step means. But to orient yourselves a little bit, on the left side, we have this gray box, and this is showing, it's actually the same as your inventory. So it's just sorting your emissions by sector. And you'll see these little exclamation marks. And these are just notating that you haven't actually applied growth rates to the emissions in that sector yet, which you need to do to finish your forecast. So it's really there just as a reminder. But you can always access the sectors too that you didn't actually have emissions for through this view as well. So that's just a little piece for navigation. And then once you're within each sector in step 3, you're going to see this layout on the right. And so what this layout is showing is you're gonna have to name it. So I kind of think of it like a record in your inventory. Name it something clear and easy to understand. So I usually just name it by the sector, so buildings and facilities, which you can see is bolded over here and also listed at the top. So just so you know where you are. And then another kind of key piece of information on this is this official box. It should be automatically selected, but I have noticed and done this myself. I accidentally click and it unchecks. And then I realize later on that I'm like, why aren't my buildings and facilities showing up in my forecast? And this is often the reason, just accidentally clicking. So make sure that box is checked. If you think some emissions are missing from your forecast, that's a good place to check. And then, as always in ClearPath, there's a notes section. You could add any data gaps or assumptions here. If you wanted to add reasoning for why you selected certain growth rates, you could certainly add that information there. And then we get to where we're actually applying these growth rates. So this box kind of reminds me of the inputs box in your inventory. So where you were adding the data to your inventory and the calculators in ClearPath. Basically, this box is showing the inventory outputs. So all of the electricity usage that was used or caused emissions in your community and was used in the inventory to calculate your emissions, and all of the natural gas usage for buildings and facilities. So this is pulling directly from your inventory, and it separates it into 2 different items, a little bit depending on the emission source, but it's showing your quantity and your CO2e. So I like to think of quantity as the activity data. If some of you remember that term, that just means the data that was used to calculate emissions, essentially. So the kilowatt hours that went into, that were, consumed by your community to cause this 4,000 CO2 emissions, metric tons of CO2. So your quantity, again, is just things like kilowatt hours. It could be VMT, gallons, that type of data, and then your actual emissions rate. And so then we move over to the right. You don't have to do anything with these. If you needed to edit these for some reason, you can, but you really shouldn't have to. That's kind of a case-by-case scenario, and would be a good thing to discuss with Mary and I. But the really important step here is actually applying the growth rates. So you are going to be applying growth rates to these specific items, so the quantity and the emissions. And so for electricity growth rate, all of the growth rates that were in that second step that I just showed you will appear in this drop-down menu. And so that's why I keep saying you're applying them, because you're selecting them here and actually applying them to the associated data that creates emissions. So for electricity, remember I was talking about your no growth rate, because we're not expecting NYPA's grid to get any cleaner or dirtier by 2030. So we're applying no growth to that. Oh, I keep doing this in my head. I'm a little backwards here, sorry. For electricity, I would think of this as electricity consumption. Instead of, I mean, if you don't expect your local government to consume more electricity by 2030, you certainly could select no growth. But probably the most accurate one would be LGO employee count. So what your employee count is going to be by 2030. If you don't have that, you could also use population growth. Or like I said, if you know a new building is going to be added, you could create a square footage growth rate and apply that here. Again, this is really going to be up to you and your specific government circumstances and thinking through what makes the most sense. And then for carbon emissions, this is where you select no growth rate, because that's the carbon intensity attached to those emissions, right? So that's going to be the no growth from your electricity grid. And then no growth, or sorry, natural gas, not no growth, natural gas. You can think of this the exact same as the quantity for electricity. So I would just use the same I used up there because it's associated with buildings and facilities. I'm expecting natural gas consumption to increase or decrease in a similar manner to electricity. So I can choose employee count. And then now after selecting that last one, you have completed applying growth rates to that sector. And you just have to hit save. And you'll see this little box pop up, and very satisfyingly, this graph appears as well and shows already what your buildings and facilities sector will look like by 2030 based on those growth rates that you just selected. And one thing I want to point out, you'll notice I hit save at the bottom instead of next. So if you hit next, this button will, or this like pop-up will appear, because you haven't, it's just saying that you haven't filled out or applied growth rates to the remaining sectors. So all of those little exclamation points I showed earlier are still there because you haven't actually applied growth rates. So if this pops up and you haven't finished, I would just hit no. You'll return to that screen. And then to navigate to the next sector, just go to your gray box and select it. And so this is going to be the exact same. Just type in the name, add any notes, and then yeah, you apply this growth rates kind of in a similar manner of thinking. So for street lights and traffic signals, you might want to be thinking, you know, do I expect there to be additional streets in my community by 2030? Do I know of streets that don't have lights that are going to have lights? You can also, if you don't expect any changes in this sector, you can apply no growth. It's totally up to you and what you think fits best. So for this, I'm going to say that I do expect streetlights to grow. So I might apply the actual Westchester County population growth. I'm just going to assume with population growth, the community is going to expand in size. That may not be the best example, but just to get you a sense of the things you should be thinking about. And then again, it's electricity. So the carbon intensity factor is no growth again. And you'll just hit save. And the same thing should happen, should appear at the top. And then we can just keep moving through our sectors. I might do this a little bit quickly so that we can move on to the planning portion, but maybe before I do, I can pause for questions at this point. Is everything making sense? Are you totally lost? Now's a good point to chime in.
There's a lot to it.
There is, yeah. So again, come to office hours, watch this recording, read our instructions, let us know how we can help.
No.
Okay, I'll keep moving through the sectors. But again, I'm going to do it a little bit quickly so we can move on. But just so you can continue to see how it works. So vehicle fleet, and each sector, there are some different things. I forgot I need to show you this. Within vehicle fleet, for the growth rate, ClearPath does actually have a standard you can use. So it's based on national standards, expected intensity of what Elijah was talking about with vehicle mileage. So miles per gallon on vehicles, just average rates of change by 2030. So as Elijah pointed out, your communities might be cleaner, but it's pretty hard to get that data for specific communities. So it's very common to use just these transportation CAFE standards, as we call them. So that's what you'll select for vehicle fleet. And then, and I did it backwards again, sorry, it's been a long day. So that's actually for carbon intensity, which it makes sense. It says carbon intensity, so that should help clue you into what should go there. And then the growth rate for your, this is going to be the gallons or VMT of your fleet vehicles. I think it's actually VMT, it says right there. So for that, you're going to want to think about, are you expecting to add a lot more vehicles to your local government operations by 2030? Are you expecting no growth? That kind of thing, specific to your gasoline fleet vehicles. And I would expect most commonly that your employee count projections, if you have them available, are going to impact how many vehicles you have. But again, just think through that and make that decision. Any considerations that might impact your own government. And so the rest of these will typically be the same, but again, think through them. It's kind of up to you and what you know about your own community. So yeah, employee count, the CAFE standards, and let's see. It gets boring as I'm just doing the same thing over and over again, so I apologize, but hopefully watching this recording will help. So again, you're just going to hit save, scroll back up to the top, and now your vehicle fleet appears. Okay, just two more. So next we have employee commute. And this one is going to be very similar to your vehicle fleet. I would just apply those default transportation. I did it backwards again. So employee count is going to be a good one for that. And then your default transportation. Hit save. Okay, and then we just have one more check mark. So we're going to go to that facility for those emissions and do the same exact thing. And yeah, for the purpose of this example, let's say, and I'm pretty sure for this example, that inventory that I used, this government does own and operate this wastewater treatment facility. So this is definitely a good scenario where you would want to apply your total county population projections instead of your employee count. But say you accounted for water, wastewater, or solid waste just for your own local government operations, then you would want to apply that employee count projection. We can just do the same for each of those and hit save. And so now all of your emissions are accounted for, but let's say you actually know that you accounted for solid waste or some other kind of weirdly specific emissions that just didn't appear in here. That can happen for a variety of reasons that I won't go into, but just for the sake of this, let's say something was missing and you know you need to add it. There is a way to add something. So let's say I know I accounted for solid waste. So I go to that sector, and then at the bottom, I haven't talked about this part yet, but just so you know, on each of your sector screens, at the bottom, you'll see this drop-down menu, and you can select the type of emissions that are missing from this view of your inventory. and you can add them in. So for the sake of this, I'll just show waste generated. So kind of a similar thing is going to appear. I'm going to say that my local government produced 400 tons of waste in 2019. And these emissions are going to be totally wrong, but I'm going to say it was 1,000 metric tons of CO2e. And then now you have that in here and can just, think of it as the exact same as the other sectors. And for solid waste, I should note the carbon intensity factor should be no growth. I can't imagine that changing and don't know of a scenario that would. So no growth for solid waste carbon intensity factor. I'm going to remove this just for the sake of the demo, but yeah, so that is now all of our growth rates are applied. So we're almost done. There's one more step that, and this is optional, but you can actually add, I'm going to show you how to add actual reduction goals to this graph and show you how to view them in the end. So that's what this next step is. It's adding reduction goals so that you can show, how far off your emissions are from the target you have in 2030. And so I already have these in here, but these are just the CLCPA, so New York statewide goals of a 40% reduction by 2030. And you just manually enter these. And we also have the 2050 goal if you want to visualize that too and get a sense of how far off you will be once you hit 2030 and want to go to 2050. You could also add new goals. Say you had your own specific goal and maybe it's for, 2025 and it's a 30% reduction. That's how you would add your own. And you certainly don't have to add the CLCPA goals if you don't want to, but something like that could be useful when you're having stakeholder discussions or in CAPs. So we're just using that as a recommended reduction goal to show. And so the last step I'm going to show you in Wizard before we move on to the planning and modeling reduction measures is just the view results of the business as usual forecast. So for this,
Caroline, sorry, can I just jump in here for a second? Because I think we talked about, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this, the fact that we've already come some distance in meeting these goals. So really, if you consider that I believe the figure was 7%, that we've already made a sort of 7% indent into that 40% goal. So if that's the case, then this should be set at 33%.
oh yes, I forgot to update them in ClearPath from what's in our document. Yes, thank you. So this should be 33%. I can double check.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, we'll send our list of data that will go into things like this that you all can be using the same exact data for. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is 33%. So yeah, so that's reduction goals. And then once you complete that step, we're going to skip step 5 in Wizard. We're having some software issues on our end. So I'm going to show you how a different way to model reduction measures. So we will be completing this step just in a different view of ClearPath. So just for your business as usual forecast, remember that's modeling your projected emissions without any action, just if you do nothing and let the world move on. So we're going to jump to view results so you can see the final graph. And you're going to name this scenario so you can actually view it. And I like to name it kind of similar naming convention I always use. So I would say my jurisdiction name, and then I would want to definitely call out the end year, so 2030, and this is my BAU, or business as usual forecast. And you're going to hit create planning scenario, and then a nice, beautiful graph will appear. And now you can see those reduction goals have been added, and they even calculate the total emissions kind of cap that you'd have to reach to reach that goal. Yeah, and another piece of kind of navigating this graph is you can deselect sectors. So if you just want to look at what happens to streetlights over time, you can just click on all of these other sectors and just streetlights will appear. Or say you want to look at buildings and facilities and streetlights alone. That's kind of a nice feature to be able to dive in a little deeper. And one more piece of information, if you want to download the graph for your action plan or just for anything at all, you can select this sort of 3-line button and download these various types of downloads. So that is one way to download the chart. And that actually wraps up the business as usual forecast. I can probably take 1 or 2 questions if there are any at this point.
There is a question in chat, Caroline. David asks, is there a reason not to use percentages when creating growth rates? It would seem like a natural. I don't know if you want to expand on that at all, David.
Yeah, it would seem to me that the normal way to assess any kind of growth would be on a percentage basis, since that's what you'd be calculating from past events. But you seem to have, both your demo and the recorded demo seem to avoid using percentages. So is there some reason for not using them?
Yes, so I'm glad you asked that actually, because it's definitely a little surprising, and I was confused by this at first too. But the way it's set up in ClearPath is that percentages, first, they have to be entered as decimals, so people often miss that. And then the other piece is that it's only the annual rate of change. So if you were to enter something for 2030, the value here would be the annual percentage of change until 2030. And I find that to be a little bit confusing, and in some circumstances it might make more sense to do it that way, but it just gets a little bit more complicated with that annual rate of change. So I think an easier way to apply a percentage is that other type of data where you're saying you're starting at 30%, or this would actually be 70% non-renewables, like I was saying earlier, and ending at 100%. Yeah, I'm getting it a little bit backwards in my head as I'm explaining it, but if there are percentages you want to add, please let me know, and I can walk you through how to do that properly. Does that make a little bit more sense, David?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I understand why you're not recommending it.
Yeah, and yeah, I think they just, whoever, our developers of ClearPath decided that in order to do an annual percentage change, the best way to do it was that through those 2 different methods, percentage versus other. So yeah, it's just kind of a funky software thing, I'd say, at the end of the day for that one.
Okay.
Judy?
Yeah, this may be a very basic question. Can you explain what we're looking at in this chart? What does the bottom line mean, and what does the top line, what does the bottom check line mean, and what does the top check line mean?
Yes, I am glad you asked, because I realized a couple of days ago that I was worried I was going to forget to explain that, and I did it again. So yes, this bottom axis is your emissions over time. So we're looking at 2021 emissions. That's just because the inventory I used in this example was a 2021 inventory. Your forecast should start with 2019. And then it's just showing the other years would appear here, right? So we have 2026 in the middle, and then this end is going to be 2030. And I'm not entirely sure why it doesn't have more years in this example. But that's what you're looking at here, is those just your yearly emissions, because this other axis is the total emissions. So it's actual metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and it's the total by sector. So that's what the different colors are. It's just showing, you'll see your employee commute was just over 5,000 metric tons in 2021, but at the end of the forecast, it's a total of 5,300 metric tons by 2030. And you'll see these do jump by year is what each of these hashes are doing. So
I get that. I guess I'm asking, what are the dotted lines?
so those are the actual reduction goals, right? So when I applied the CLCPA 2050 of 85% reduction goal, it's just showing up here as, instead of the percentage change, it's showing the total emissions that you would have to be at in order to reach that goal.
So what that doesn't mean, that green line isn't the reduction goal for just the bottom color there. That's for the whole darn thing, right?
Yes, exactly. So a better way to look at it is with everything turned on.
That's a big difference.
Yes, I mean, and that's the 2050 goal, right? So your 2030 CLCPA goal is quite a bit higher. It's still a little, might be scary for some people to look at, but yeah, it's there to help you think through what really needs to get done in order to reach that goal.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Great. I think I should move on. Okay, yes. So now we have our business as usual forecast, and we're going to move on to the planning side of things. So where you're creating a scenario which shows how certain actions can impact your emissions. So that would be things like electrifying your buildings, or I don't know, I'll show you all the different options. There are a lot, like adding solar panels, that kind of thing is what we'll be modeling next. So, sorry, the lights in my room turned off a bit. There we go. So for this, we're actually going to go back to the home screen, the government track. And then you're gonna, instead of going to forecasts or inventories, you're gonna jump over to this next module, planning. And very similar format as inventories and forecasts. Various planning scenarios is what we call them will appear at the bottom. You'll even see that the business as usual forecast planning scenario I just created appeared here. And that's because this module is very much so connected to the forecasting module. So the data will be shared between the two, but this is the place where it's working right now to be able to apply these reduction strategies. So that's why I'm showing you this. And so a few things. So our first button here is this emission reductions goal. And that is actually the exact same data that I just showed you in Wizard. So you can kind of ignore that, or you can also edit these goals here or add other goals if you'd like to. I just suggest doing that in Wizard. And then the next one is new reduction strategy, which I'll show you in just a moment, because that's where you'll actually be adding various strategies and creating them based on your own kind of specific inputs. And then our third one is new planning scenario. And so this is how you're actually going to create your planning scenario, which is essentially, it's also a 2030 forecast, but it's going to be one with reduction measures applied. So showing the change in emissions if you do certain actions. So I'll just, you can name it whatever makes the most sense to you, but I'm just going to call it that because that's fairly clear. And then instead of selecting your inventory here, you're going to select a forecast. And the forecast you want to select is the business as usual forecast that you just created, because you're taking that business as usual forecast and showing how actions actually impact emissions on that, essentially the same graph. So that might make a little more sense in a moment here, but select the business as usual forecast you just created and hit create planning scenario. And again, like I said, it's just going to create that same graph because it's pulling the same data, the same information from that business as usual scenario. And then we're going to add reduction measures. And before I add reduction measures, I'll show you a little bit around this. So all of this is the same, it's the same exact graph. You can deselect things the same way. The difference here is that we can add new reduction measures. So when you first start your planning scenario, nothing will appear in this drop-down menu. I do have a couple examples here just because this is a demo account, but you will need to add reduction measures in a different window, which I'll show you in just a moment, in order to actually add them here. But that's just kind of navigating this page. So I've created my planning scenario and I am ready to add actions. So I'm going to go to planning, and then this is the step where I'm going to select new reduction strategy. And this brings you to a page where all of the different types of measures that ClearPath can calculate are listed. So it's a lot like the calculators in your inventory, and it's just a massive list. It's not as big in local government operations, but in community-wide it is maybe 3 times the size. So just a heads up if you ever do this in community-wide. And then one way to navigate all of these calculators a little bit more easily is by using this filter calculators gray box. I usually like to do it by sector just because it's, you know, attached to your inventory. So I like to think of the measures I'm wanting to add to my forecast by sector, right? So what actions can I do to lower my buildings and facilities emissions? What can I do to impact solid waste facilities? That's a good way to think of it. And so for today, I'm going to show you one from buildings and facilities. So probably the highest impact action you all can apply to your scenario is this converting space heating to heat pumps. I say most likely because all of your inventories are different. You're going to have different sectors, but one of the highest impact actions is always going to be building electrification. So that's our example for today. And so just like in your inventory, you're going to select that calculator, and a very similar page is going to appear as the calculators in your inventory. So that's kind of nice. And you're just going to fill it out a lot like your inventory calculators. And so I, again, like to do kind of a similar naming convention. I might name it buildings and facilities, and then the actual action I'm taking, so electrification, or maybe efficiency could go here if you're doing an efficiency measure, that type of thing. And then I like to also specify the activity that I'm, you know, applying that measure to. So in this case, I am electrifying natural gas in buildings, because I'm converting that natural gas furnace to a heat pump. And so just like in your inventory, there are factor sets, which I can certainly help you with. But if any of you have questions on that, please let us know. You can always check what factor set was used in your inventory by going to the record in your inventory. So I can show you that just real quick so you all know where to find that information. But go to your inventories module, and as normal, just hit edit records. And then I want to see what factor set, show you again, was used for grid electricity in my inventory. So I want to find a record in ClearPath that used grid electricity, hit edit, and you'll see this factor sets portion listed up here. And I can confirm that this is the factor set that was used in my inventory. So this is the one that I should have selected here. So that's kind of the key information at the top. And then we scroll down, and again, it looks just like the calculators in your inventory. You have an inputs box and an outputs box. So the inputs box is where you're, similar to your inventory, adding the data that you want ClearPath to take and do some calculations to do some of the work for you. So specifically for this calculator, what that looks like is this just current natural gas use of buildings to be retrofitted. So for this, again, it's going to be a lot up to you what you put here. I can talk you through it and help you figure out what makes the most sense for your own community. But a few ways to think of it are, I mean, the first and simplest way is, say you think you can and you really want to completely electrify all of your buildings and facilities by 2030. That's probably pretty aggressive, maybe not very likely, but let's say you want to model that or understand what that looks like. So then you would just go to, and I do want to show you this because I think it's helpful. You'll have to go actually to your business as usual forecast and find the end year value, the end year natural gas consumption from your forecast. So the natural gas is expected to be consumed by your local government operations in 2030. And so to go to that, I'm just going to open it in a new tab. So you go back to your forecast. Sorry, I have a bar thing in the lanes. Yeah, so you'll go back to your forecast. Nice of that. And to navigate back to your forecast, which I mentioned earlier, your BAU1, you're going to want to select Edit in Wizard instead of Edit Records. This takes you to the wizard view, which is what I showed you, and is a much easier way to look at it. But this is an important piece of information for applying reduction measures, because it is a way to obtain data that will help you fill out those inputs, which I'll be back to in just a moment. So to get the data from your business as usual forecast, you're going to jump ahead to apply growth rates. And there's a nice little button here that says export. It's not super obvious. I'm totally aware of that, but it is a really nice feature to have. So if you click export, it will actually give you a CSV file, so an Excel file of the projected emissions and the activity data for that sector. So I won't show you what it looks like, but just know that that's there, and that's where you find that piece of data. And so for that, I'm just going to take the end year value. If I wanted to fully electrify all buildings by 2030, that's what scenario we're in, I would take that end year value of natural gas consumption from that Excel file and apply it here. So that's how you would do 100% electrification. If you wanted to focus, and this is probably a lot more likely for all of you, if you wanted to think about just retrofitting one of your buildings or two of your buildings, hopefully you have the data on the natural gas consumption from those buildings, and that's what you would apply here, right? So if you know you're going to be able to install a heat pump in your city hall, and you know that natural gas usage or that natural gas consumption, that's the value that you'll put here. Another way to do this, and this might make more sense for 2050 forecast, you could think about just retrofitting 5% or 10% of your building stock every year. So there are a few ways to do this, but those are kind of the options, and always happy to talk through them. So that's probably the most important input for heat pumps and building electrification. These other two are, we do have defaults in ClearPath for you. So this 80% efficiency of furnaces or boilers is just a US average. If you can get this specific data from the building that you want to use in this measure, you can certainly apply that here. A building or facility manager might have that information. I don't know. But this 80% you're totally welcome to use. It's a good piece of data to use if you need to. And same with this heat pump performance factor. So this is just kind of the efficiency of the heat pump so that it can better estimate the emissions reductions based on that efficiency change. So 8.2 is also a US national average. If you want to do a little research and find the heat pump performance factor of heat pumps in your climate or your region, you certainly can. I can help with that as well. I just haven't had a ton of time to find that for Hudson Valley area. So that's it for inputs on this one. It's not too hard, depending on how easy it is to get the data that you need. That's the input section. And then the last section is the outputs. And you'll probably remember in the inventory section, you weren't actually doing anything in this sector or this section. But in the planning module and adding reduction measures, you actually can. So I mentioned a scenario where if you wanted to electrify 5% of your building stock every year, you could do that in this calculator. And that's where this cumulative column comes into play. So let's say that 5% of my building stock every year is 10,000 therms of natural gas consumption. Right now, when it's not selected as cumulative, it's just saying a total savings of natural gas by 2030 of 1,000, because that's an MMBTU, so that was converted from therms. But if you wanted to show this year over year, accumulating in savings, because you're doing 5% is 10,000 therms per year, you'll just check cumulative. And that's just saying that you are saving 1,000 MMBTU of natural gas per year by 2030. I'm not going to select that for this scenario because I think that's going to be a lot less common for you all, but just know it's an option, and that's what this cumulative column means. So now that I have my action or my reduction measure completely filled out, I can always add notes again if any assumptions or data gaps were made in creating this number, or if you wanted to add a note that this record is specific to a specific building, or anything like that is useful to include there. So I will hit save, and then it'll jump you back out to this section. I probably should have named this something different because I already had a measure in here named the same thing. So I'm just going to delete that. So that's something to watch out for. Make sure you're not naming your reduction strategies the exact same thing, because it will be quite confusing. But now you'll see it appeared here. And I would recommend seeing how these apply in your planning scenario after creating each one. So now that I've created my reduction measure, I'm going to go back to the planning module, scroll down, find my planning scenario, which I labeled very clearly, so that's helpful. I'm going to select edit records, and we're back to the screen that I showed you earlier. And now I can actually apply this reduction measure. So I'm going to select the one that I want, which is the one that I just created. Hit add. And then a couple important steps here are that you need to select a start year. So the year that you start to implement this action, which I would recommend doing actually 2024 or later, because you're just doing the modeling to start the decision-making process and use in your decision-making process, right? So in reality, this measure is not going to be implemented until at least the following year, maybe later. But this allows you to really decide when you want that implemented, so it makes it a little bit more customizable. And then the end year for this is going to be 2030. But if you, for example, if you knew that a building was going to be electrified or have a heat pump installed by 2027, you could definitely show that instead. Just select the end year you want. And then the last step is to make sure you select active, because that's what will actually apply it to the graph up here. And so the last key step to applying your measure is hitting save, and you'll see it. You'll see that updating scenario loading box, and then you should have seen, hopefully you all saw this jump. I can do it again, but you can see the original forecast is this blue line at the top. So that's showing what your business's usual total emissions were without applying any reduction strategy. And now you can see there's a gap between the top of that and your buildings and facilities. So I'll just show that again. So watch this yellow portion of the bar go back up as I hit save. Yeah, so I think that's the really fun and satisfying piece of all of this, is you're actually seeing how reduction measures can impact your emissions not in real time technically, but sort of in real time on the graph. So that's very satisfying. And yeah, so that's how you model just one reduction measure. I don't have time to go into more today, but we will be sending a guide with a lot more information on some of the higher impact reduction measures that you can model in ClearPath. And like I've said a lot today, come to office hours, please let me help you with these because they are fun to add. They help a lot with your climate action plans. And I know they're a little bit more complicated, so I'm always happy to talk through them a little bit more with you. But that wraps it up on my end. Mary, do we have time for some questions?
Not really.
Yeah. So come to office hours.
Come to office hours. Yeah. I just want to make sure I get through the homework and next steps. So that's okay. But
Yeah,
thank
no
you so
worries.
much,
Thank you.
Caroline. So obviously this is a really sophisticated and interesting tool, and it's, I think, going to be really helpful in terms of figuring out if you continue on business as usual, where you'll be versus your goals, and then when you model out certain actions, how much that will help you towards reaching your goal. So again, it's really a great first step as you begin to think about your high impact action items for your climate action plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. I'm going to first give you a little bit of information about the inventory report, because I know a lot of you are still working on that, and I don't want to get ahead of myself in terms of some of the questions I've been seeing. I would say about 30% of you have finished your reports, but the others are still deep into these. So the questions that I'm hearing, I'm not going to run through these all right now because we're obviously very short on time, but here are the questions. Where do I find my pie chart? How do I update table of contents? How do I add new photos? And again, if you have these questions, I encourage you to just look at this report. I'm going to update it to the upload it to the CAPI website, so you can see how to do these things. But you know, there's some sort of, I would say, word related questions, and then there's some more sort of technical questions, like how to add in buildings and break out the buildings and electricity sector in ClearPath. And that's something, again, as I say here, you can look at the detailed report tab and pull data out manually to create some of your own charts. The sectors that aren't included, you should just delete those rows, and I'd encourage you to please mention those emissions and why that is a climate smart community requirement. So which sectors didn't you include and why? Whether it's water, wastewater, et cetera, refrigerants, off-road vehicles, again, you should just mention those somewhere in your report. Should I share my inventory with my town council? The quick answer is yes. If you can set up a meeting in the next couple of months, that's ideal. Sharing your inventory is an ideal way to bring them up to speed on the accounting and the analysis, all the report work that you've done to date, and also to kind of seed the idea of the climate action plan, which of course is the next step and something that you'll be going back to them to share with them. So that's important that they understand that that's the next step, and that, you know, you'll be working over the next really 8 months to do that. Formal adoption of the inventory is not required, but you can choose to do that if you think that's an important step, and it obviously helps solidify the inventory and raise awareness. If you want to create a chart with without one of the sectors, you can check information only, and then you can just export the pie chart you see as a result of that sector being excluded, and then you can go back in and re-add that sector. Where in my website should I put the report? Just anywhere prominent. Again, doesn't really matter. This goes for the CAP as well, because you're going to be wanting to post your draft climate action plan as well. Okay, so now we're officially moving on to climate action planning. And I want to talk briefly about outreach and engagement, because this is an important component of this CAP process, and it's something that needs to ideally start at the beginning of the process. I know Maddie mentioned at the end of her presentation that she wished she'd formed a committee, and I think my short answer is it's not too late. I think I would encourage that right now, because involving key government department stakeholders in this process, in this climate action planning process, is really critical. It's a municipal CAP, so these are actions that the municipality is going to have to implement, and therefore their input is really critical. So what are the requirements? Basically, you have to include the government stakeholders. You need to provide an opportunity for the public to review and comment on the draft action plan, and you have to develop a communication and engagement strategy. And for doing those things, you get an extra 4 points in the Climate Smart Communities program. So I've created something called a CAPI Guidance for Public Outreach Engagement Planning doc, and I'm going to go over that briefly with you all. I've also posted it to the CAPI website so you can use it. I encourage you to fill it out. It will help strategize and ensure the success of your public outreach component as part of the larger CAP process. And again, this is something that is important to begin right away. So you identify your potential stakeholders and potential partners. You list short-term efforts to connect with targeted audiences, especially disadvantaged communities. If you're not sure if you're in a disadvantaged communities, you can click on the link in this presentation and it will show you the DEC DAC map. And you create a rough timeline for your outreach efforts. The plan itself can be submitted to the CSC as part of the submission to create a communication engagement strategy. So if you want, again, you can use it as you go through the process, and then you can upload it as part of your submission. And also, not to forget, you will need to provide an opportunity for the public to review and comment on the draft operation CAP. So at some point when your draft is done, you'll have to upload it to the website and provide enough time for people to review it. So just at a high level, the next 4 months, and we'll really drill into more detail on each of these over the coming meetings. But for September, the key milestones are to meet with your team, and you might want to try and find more volunteers for this next section of CAPI, because there is a fair amount of work, and it's a pretty ambitious timeline here. You'll want to finalize the outreach plan, and which I've just spoken about, but I'll show it to you after I go through this. Complete the ICLEI forecast. So for the next meeting, your homework will be just to complete the first part of what Caroline reviewed. So just the business as usual forecast. If you want to start modeling high impact actions, you can obviously go ahead and do that, but it will not be part of your homework, and we'll provide a really detailed guidance document on the business as usual forecast to help you with that. And then in September, drafting high impact actions is also part of what is expected. So again, this is just an initial list of high impact actions that you think make sense coming out of your inventory. And many of you have already included this in your inventory report. So this shouldn't be too challenging. There's also a list that I'll be providing you with and going over in detail at our next meeting of all the high impact action and initiative options. So you can take a look at them and again, start thinking about what makes most sense for your municipality. Then in October, you'll hold the first stakeholder meeting. And this is where you'll bring the key government municipal leaders together to go over the high impact action items that you're thinking about and get their feedback. You'll research the co-benefits of some of those action items, meet again with your team, and revise the high impact action list. November, you'll convene additional stakeholder meetings, add co-benefits if needed, meet again with the team, and finalize the list of high impact actions. And then in December is when your draft climate action plan is due. Even though this CAPI process goes through the first quarter, ideally you'll have your draft CAP done in December. That way you'll have ample time for feedback from the key stakeholders and the community before finalizing it. There'll be a team meeting number 4, a review of the CAP again, and a dissemination of the draft CAP. So that's sort of where we are. I'm just going to quickly, before I go over the homework, I'm just going to quickly show you the public engagement and the outreach and engagement document that I'm going to be posting. As you can see, it has some very sort of straightforward questions. And it's really just to help you think about how to do outreach. You are encouraged to appoint an outreach lead. And then again, you can make a larger team or a subset of the team to focus on this outreach component. Ideally, people who have trusted connections to key stakeholder groups. And the key stakeholders probably are this group right here that I've listed, or a subset of this group, or maybe there'll be a few others that you want to include, but thinking through not only the departments, but who in the departments you think should be at that key stakeholder meeting is going to be something to think about before the next meeting. Because again, if you want to plan that meeting for October, really you need to figure out who to invite and when it's going to be in September. And maybe you want to call this a committee. To Maddie's point, I think it's important to make people feel that they're part of this process, that they're being consulted on what's being included in the plan, and you know, that they're accountable. Maybe you want to create an initial PowerPoint presentation on this process and put that up onto the website. That's a good way to kind of initiate this process before posting your actual draft climate action plan in December, and then your final CAP in sometime in the February-March time period. If you want to hold any workshops or community events, again, this is just really a space to think about that and maybe brainstorm some events you might want to be at or a part of, either with a table or flyers or whatever. Again, this is an optional component, but a great way to kind of get the word out on what you're doing. Same goes for emails or mailings, if you want to include it in a mayor's message or something like that, or flyers or social media. Good to kind of think that through early on and plan when and how you're going to do that. Same with partner groups and budget, and key is documentation. When you submit this, you're going to want to document the process that you've gone through, either through photos, any of meetings you have. You'll need attendance lists, presentations, and any press coverage. So that's just a very quick overview. I know we only have a couple more minutes, so I'll go right back to the homework, and hopefully we can finish on time. But for the next meeting, if you haven't completed your greenhouse gas inventory report, that is clearly the next step. But if you have, you should review and complete a draft of the outreach and engagement plan that I just showed you. That it shouldn't take too long, but again, it's just really a thought-provoking kind of an exercise that will hopefully help you later on. Complete the business as usual forecast and clear path. Both the video, the link is in this presentation. I sent it out earlier, but both that video and the guide that Caroline and I will send you will hopefully help you with that business as usual forecast. And then if you haven't already scheduled or met with your village board or town council to present your inventory results and inform them on next steps, then that's something that you should do. And our next meeting will be Thursday, October 5th. As I mentioned, we'll be going through the high impact actions and initiatives in a much more detailed way, trying to figure out what makes most sense, what the costs of each of them are, and really what the emissions reductions impact is. So what you do in ClearPath is obviously helpful. It's not mandatory, but it can really help you to think through which high impact actions to prioritize. So with that, I will, I think, say goodbye. I hope, unless anyone has any really quick questions, but I know we're really out of time at this point. So I want to thank you all, and I will see you in October.
Thank you.
Again. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.